Couture and Brandon Scott will be with us in the subscriber section talking about a time slip that Ann and I and the two of them experienced just recently. It was quite astonishing, and we will be describing it in detail and the efforts that we have made to document the reality of this event, which I think, since all four of us in different ways were witness to it, is quite amazing. So do listen up in the subscriber section. Here on Dreamland, we have an exciting expert with us, the author of Time Travel Now, William F. Hamilton III. Bill is a former Air Force Security Service member. He has been involved with the National Security Agency, and he's also written a really cool book called Time Travel Now, the latest information, facts, and strange stories on the incredible reality of time travel. And some of the stories I've referred to in passing in previous shows about time travel, such as the mysterious events at Versailles and other stories like this, Bill's nailed them all down. So we're going to be getting into that over the course of this interview. We're going to have I think, a really interesting time. Bill, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Whitley.
Let me ask you this. One always thinks of time travel as kind of a science fictional thing. And yet in here, I have read material that is so close to experiences I've actually had, and we'll get into that later in the program, that I have to ask you, frankly, where do you come out? I mean, as a researcher in this, are we in a world in which time travel happens?
I believe that we are in a universe in which time travel happens.
Now, in a universe, you make it sound larger than just us. In other words, of course, there's close encounters of the third kind going on in our world too. Do you suggest then that there is something related to time travel there?
Well, yes, but in fact, what I was talking about is space travel. When we have space travel between solar systems, then we're talking about relativistic velocities. And relativistic velocities of space traveling will always involve some time traveling, because there's the time differential between the clock on the spacecraft and the point of departure.
We all understand the fact that relativity would induce de facto time travel in anyone who was traveling at a speed approaching the speed of light.
Well, this is where I start, because this is where science comes in. In other words, science will admit that if we travel at 99% of the velocity of light and visit Alpha Centauri and return to the Earth, our point of departure, we will find out that we have only traversed that distance in about, a year or so. And yet maybe 4 to 8 years have passed on the Earth. In other words, what I'm pointing out here is that time travel may be happening more commonly than we think.
Well, I would certainly agree with you there, because there is, especially in the sense of that Stephen Hawking, for example, now admits that movement through time, I think it was in October of 1993, he said he believed that movement through time must be possible. But science assumes it would take an enormous amount of energy. However, for those of us to whom it has happened, I mean, I was standing on a street corner in New York when it happened to me. There was no energy involved at all. I just suddenly kind of slipped back into the past, and a lot of people you mentioned in your book did that too. But before we get into that, let's touch on the alien connection again, because you mentioned a man named Dan Burish in the book who makes a surprising statement about an alien he allegedly interviewed called J-Rod, claiming that he had come back from the future, that he was, in fact, at least partially a human being, and they had come back into the past to try to correct their own past because of what had happened to them. So why don't we begin by you telling us a little bit about Dan Burish and his background and frankly, his bona fides.
Dan Burish, also previously known as Dan Crane, he changed his name legally in Las Vegas, was a kind of a child prodigy who grew up interested in the microscope. In fact, he was one of the youngest members of the Los Angeles Microscopical Society, and he's also trained in looking for at cells and looking at various pathologies under the microscope by a medical doctor in Long Beach. And as he grew up, his grandfather passed away from cancer. So when he went and entered the University of Nevada at Las Vegas, his parents had relocated to Las Vegas. He studied biology with every intent to go on to postgraduate studies in medicine and medical research. It was in 1986 when Dan was in college and started his biological research that he was approached by three men. He had written a proposal to NASA about, he was interested in Martian exobiology as well, and this had to do with the transplantation of protozoa to Martian exobiology. And he had indeed got a reply from NASA, which was very positive. And so probably following this, these three men, I believe two of them identified themselves as being with the Department of Naval Intelligence, had come up to him and offered him a position in a very shadowy government project. And just to kind of make a long story short, that's when Dan accepted the offer, by the way, and then was sent up to Area 51 briefly, followed again by being sent up to an underground facility at the highly secretive Site 4 near Area 51, and that's located under Papoose Mountain on the Nevada test site. And he was astonished at the equipment that had been transported and set up in the newly established biolabs that occupied level 4 and 5. And one thing led to another, and that's how Dan had an encounter with the J-Rod, which the J-Rod was an extraterrestrial biological entity housed within a clean sphere on level 5 of that very same facility.
And we'll be returning to that facility in just a moment. Bill Hamilton's book, Time Travel Now, available from the unknowncountry.com store, bookstores everywhere. Don't miss it. And don't miss Starfire Tor and Brandon Scott, Ann Strieber and Whitley Strieber in a really remarkable discussion about an actual time slip that occurred in all four of our lives at the same quote-unquote time just a few weeks ago in the subscriber section. And here's something equally incredible in a way in the lead article in the November. And here's something equally incredible in the lead article in the new. And here's something equally incredible. The lead article in the New Scientist for the September 30th issue is about an experiment that's going to be performed soon that will confirm or deny whether or not the past is affected by its own future. We will be able to determine using this experiment whether or not things we do now can change the past. Is it actually happening? Well, listening to Bill Hamilton and listening to what the incredible story you're going to hear in the subscriber section, I have to think apparently it is. And we're getting closer and closer to knowing that and empirically confirming it. And as we learned from Dean Radin, once these things are confirmed by science, they suddenly become very, very much more powerful. And by the way, speaking of powerful, I want you to read Whitley's journal this week because of the children. This is a journal about, it's a reflection on the 1985 Finders case that came up in my mind because I was thinking, of course, about the awful, sad Mark Foley situation, so tragic and so ugly, and how there is a lot of child abuse being hidden behind the walls of secrecy and power. And I happened to get a copy of a report by an investigator, a U.S. Customs Service investigator, who investigated the Finders case. And you really need to look at the journal and read this report. It is extraordinary, and it was all covered up by the CIA. That can't stand. We have to do something about this. We cannot let our children be abused by people in power simply because they're powerful. It's just not on. We'll be right back. We're back, and we're talking to Bill Hamilton. We've been talking about Dr. Dan Burish, and we were in the lab with Dr. Dan Burish, and he was communicating via thought with a visitor called J-Rod, who had just told him that he was one of us, that he was from our future. Dan, why don't you pick up the story? Bill, why don't you pick up the story at this point?
Okay, well, he found out through communication and then with the J-Rod, and then later through briefings that he was given once the powers that be found out that he had been in communication with the J-Rod, and he found out that the J-Rod was from our distant future. In fact, 52,000 years ahead of our time. And that the J-Rod specifically came back to our time, or actually with 3 other J-Rods from a different era in their timeline, and had crashed, landed in Kingman, Arizona in 1953. And the reason why they returned was to, number one, to find out if there was some way that they could correct a genetic defect that they had because of the split in the human genome that occurred during a catastrophe in their past here on the Earth. It was subsequent to this catastrophe. It is still in our future. And when they did come back and merged with our timeline here, they did something that scientists, or I should say scientists in the black world, according to Dan, said was they did not think it was possible, and that was that the two timelines, our timeline, their timeline, converged. And it was like a superposition. It was like something that happens in quantum mechanics, where we understand one wave superposed on another wave will form a new wave of time. And they were hoping to find a way not only to correct this defect in their people, but they had brothers, which was the other split in the genome, which they described as tall, blonde, Aryan-looking humans who had gone to another part of the galaxy. And they themselves had gone to Zeta Reticuli in our future, and the tall blondes had gone to somewhere close to the middle star in the belt of Orion. And the two had gotten together again in our future and decided that by traveling back, because now they had the capability of traveling backward and forward in time, that they would find a way to maybe circumvent this catastrophe, since now they had knowledge of what exactly occurred, and perhaps they could reduce the chance of it occurring again, as well as save themselves. This gets to be a very complex story, but it introduces a new factor into the UFO hypothesis, and that is not all UFOs may be just from some other planetary system, but also from some other time. So that's another thing that kind of motivated me to look even further into.
I think this is hugely important because
yes.
I believe that there is a time factor of some sort involved in this. In fact, I would go so far as to say I'm fairly sure of it. But I would like to now, you touched on controversies involving Dr. Burish, Dan Burish,
yes.
Dan Crane. What could you talk a little bit about those and what is going on with this?
Well, the controversies are such that they were kind of stirred up by statements made by individuals who have a background in the Defense Intelligence Agency or with the Air Force Office of Special Investigation, people who are also claiming that they have knowledge of the extraterrestrials. They were briefed on extraterrestrials, especially from Zeta Reticuli. People who claim they have knowledge of people who work in these programs. And they took up a dispute about the claims of Dan Burish. However, it seems that the requirements, at least stated by Dan, of his particular work were such that he would have been operating at a security level beyond any security level these other people had. But there's another aspect to it, and that is that Dan himself is interested. He's a very brilliant guy, and he's not just interested in biology or even just the sciences, but it goes beyond that. And he's very, very much interested in theology, metaphysical subjects, sacred geometry, music, the geometry of music, and certain other things because of certain discoveries that he had made that were instigated by his communication with the J-Rod about our origins and the origins of life on this planet. And he had gone to a certain geological unconformity there in Nevada, up in the mountains, and had discovered that way back, even prior to the Precambrian era and the explosion of the various life forms on this planet, there was some kind of a seed, there was some kind of progenitor seed to all of this. And he feels like he had discovered that in something that he called the Ganesh particle. And this Ganesh particle seemed to just appear when a certain opening or portal appeared, when he stimulated crystals. And these portals, he describes, seem to be multidimensional. And he has actually videotaped the opening of these portals and the activity that follows when they do open. And he feels that, unlike the theory of panspermia, where life was seeded on Earth from, you might say, rain from space, raining particles and debris from comets and what have you. He feels like life was stimulated by the appearance of these Ganesh particles and some other particles that come through these portals. And that if there was sufficient energy in the bedrock many, many millions of years ago, that these portals would have opened, and they already came encoded with DNA and with various patterns to establish life under the right conditions. As long as the environment was right, it could establish life. Therefore, Dan believes, as a scientist, that life could arise on many worlds where conditions are suitable through this means.
Now, with regard to Dr. Dan Crane, Dan Burish, or the other names he's appeared under, I have in my life talked to one person who was, without question, in a very definite position where he would have knowledge of these matters, these deep secrets involving UFOs, aliens, and presumably also time travel, etc. He never told me anything. However, just because of that conversation, he ended up under house arrest for the rest of his life, just because he wanted to, not because he did anything or said anything. And I have to ask the question then, is this man a cutout and legitimate? In other words, is he working for somebody? Because he's certainly not doing this simply on his own. He can't be. That does not happen. The system is too effective. Or is he, if he is a rogue of some kind, then he cannot be saying anything that is of any concern to the people who do keep the secrets, or he would not be there anymore. It's as simple as that. So when we get back, I'm going to ask Bill which he thinks it is, and what that may mean. We'll be right back. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We're talking to Bill Hamilton. His book, Time Travel Now, Inner Light Global Communications. It is available from the unknowncountry.com store, available in bookstores, on Amazon, wherever you want to buy it. But do shop with us. We offer personal service over and above the kind of service you may get from a larger internet retailer, as well as prices just about the same as the cheapest you can find online. Plus, if you're an unknowncountry.com subscriber, you get an additional 10% off. Very well worth it. And you get to keep listening to this radio show because we do depend on you. Now, let's get back to the question of Dr. Dan Burish that I asked before we left the air. Since it's not possible that someone would be out in public just doing this on their own, what do you think is the case? Is he faking it and irrelevant, therefore, to the community that he claims to represent? Or is he a cutout being intentionally sent out into the public to bleed out information?
Okay, well, Dan is somebody who I found to be very honest and truthful. I have discussed this with his parents. His parents corroborate his story, and they tell me that Dan was always a very honest child. You know, he didn't just make up things and tell stories. He wasn't that type of person. I've talked to a few friends that knew him. They all tend to support him. So there are documents on this. But it seems that Dan believed that it was in the best interest of the public to know something about this. So a few years ago, he started saying a few things, but this was always to another person that was close by, and then this person would leak it out to the public, the vast public at large. For this, he was penalized several times, but it was felt that his role working with the J-Rod was so valuable in the biological sciences that they needed him. So they couldn't. They did attempt to do things like alter his memory and physically even hurt him at one point in time. But then there was a turnaround because there was a change, we might say, a change in command. Now, he claims to have worked directly under the group that we term Majestic 12. But they, for a period of time, when I first came into contact with Dan, were working for a committee of the majority. That's what he called it, the Committee of the Majority. The Committee of the Majority, I believe around the year 2004, was dissolved, and all authority was put back into the hands of Majestic 12. And at that point, Majestic 12 started condoning him to say certain things because the number of years that we had left between now and the coming catastrophe that J. Rod was talking about was so short that it would be better to acclimatize the public to it. And then finally, last year, he was given a written authorization to tell his story as much as he recalled it in every detail. And if he needed some assistance by reference to some documents, that would be provided. And so he has done so, and he has debriefed on his 16-plus years of involvement in this on a DVD. He is officially retired from the Majestic 12. In fact, the Majestic 12, as a group assembled, no longer is assembled. They have disassembled themselves. And whether they will reconvene at sometime in the future, or there will be new members or whatever, it's hard to say. I have no idea. And you have to realize that what I am conveying to you is what has been conveyed to me, and some of which I have seen. I have been fortunate enough to see, I would say, some evidence of all of this. I would find it hard to believe that it was a collaborative hoax, so that's a possibility. But there are elements in this, in the information that Dan has given me, that correlate with another source of information that I've had for some time.
Well, they correlate with sources of information I have also, and
right,
including directly from the visitors themselves. Which, you talk about the horse's mouth. I have been there, and his story is consistent with things that they said to me or communicated to me long before I'd ever heard of him, and also with things like the statement about J-Rod that I quoted earlier that's in your book that I have never made to anybody, which was communicated to them by them to me very graphically one day. And so I think there is something in what he's saying. So now we're going to we'll try to get in touch with Dan Burge now that he's doing some public interviewing, and see if we can't get him on the air, folks, and just go into this a little bit more deeply, because it's beginning to seem as if the guy may have something. Now, I want to go on, though, because this is a much bigger book. It doesn't just cover the Dan Burge story. It covers a whole bunch of other really cool things. Now, there is something that I want to lead into here by talking about the story of Brian Scott, a contactee, that some person who was in communication with an entity called the host. And Bill, in his book, says, the host states again and again that, quote, time is of the mind. Now, this, to me, Bill, is the key to the whole thing, because I think that movement through time is possible physically, and that the mind is the arbiter of this. Now, I would like to go straight from here to some of the stories that for example, tell us, if you will, some of the stories about these strange objects that have been found that seem to be from the deep past that you mentioned in your book. And as we're talking, I'm just looking for them, but I'm sure you remember exactly what I'm talking about.
Yes, I do. And the first time, in fact, that I had heard about these artifacts that have been found, well, just happened to come from a UFO contactee named Daniel Fry, who I knew very well when I was a teenager. And he was giving a lecture one day, and he talked about this discovery that was made deep underground in a coal mine. In other words, so here were coal miners just digging away at the side of the mine, and they ran across a blade and dug it out, and the blade was part of a knife. In other words, what they dug out was a knife, and the deposit that it was buried in was millions, hundreds of millions of years old. In other words, according to our theory of history, of course, there were no intelligent artifact-making humanoids or primates or any type of artifact-making intelligence around 500 million years ago. And so how did this knife get embedded in this coal mine at such a deep level? And, of course, there were artifacts found in Africa, like you probably recall the spheres with the little groove around it.
Yes, I've talked to the curator at that museum. I studied those spheres extensively. Tell us a little bit about them.
Well, and there's two schools of thought on that. And, of course, one is that these spheres may be formed naturally, right? This is one of the beliefs. And, of course, others dispute that and say that they were formed artificially because they're so uniform in size. The little groove is fairly uniform in size, and we seem to have something very similar to it on one of the satellites of Saturn in our solar system on a large scale, right? So, there could be debate about an object like these little spheres, but then there's geodes that have been found, like in Death Valley. There was a geode found when it was broken open. There was a definite artificial object inside of it that appeared to look like a spark plug. And, of course, that geode was estimated to have been around for millions of years, and of course, we know that if it were a spark plug, spark plugs haven't been around that long. So the question with these out-of-place artifacts or out-of-time artifacts is, what are they doing in this strata where no one has discovered them except in modern times, but in a strata that is millions, hundreds of millions, or even so much as a couple of billion years old.
Yeah, and there are a lot of them around the world. It's not just this.
Right.
Yeah. Tell us about some of the others.
I'm just, the one I was mentioning, the Koso artifact,
right,
was found. This is one they X-rayed, and you can see there is a definite symmetrical object with a hexagonal casing, right? That has been revealed by X-rays.
As you point out in the book, has all of the components of a spark plug. But now it's been objected to by someone who said that they thought it could not be. It could have perhaps been encased very recently. But I talked to an archaeologist, and it was found inside a geode. And geodes don't form in mud over a period of 100 years. So what's the truth here?
Well, they estimated that this rock, this geode it was found in, was 500,000 years old. So the question becomes this. One possibility is there were ancient civilizations on Earth, which seems unlikely. Okay, I mean, that ancient, right?
Well, if they really did a heck of a job of cleaning up after themselves to just leave these few little bits and pieces.
Right. Then we get the possibility, well, we had visitors on the ancient Earth from other planets who had already developed technology, and they left some trash around that we've discovered. Then the third hypothesis, which is fascinating in our case, is these were left by time travelers. In other words, someone from the future traveled to the very early Earth, and some of these things got left around. There was probably some kind of a handbook that says thou shalt not leave any trash behind, but got left anyway. So those are the possibilities, regardless of the source of these objects, and they would have to be studied in great detail to find out, exactly which hypothesis is more likely. But they exist. They are anomalies. And that's fascinating because we're talking about physical anomalies that suggest the possibility of time travel.
Well, we're going to take a little break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the Dropa and the Han. You probably don't know who the Dropa and the Han are, or you may, but I can assure you, after you've heard what Bill has to say about them, you will never forget them. We'll be right back. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We're talking to William Hamilton. His book, Time Travel Now. You can get it from the unknowncountry.com store. You can get it from your local bookseller or anywhere else you wish to buy books, but do get it. It's a really good compendium of time travel stories and speculations that will do two things, and one of them is very important. It will open your mind to these possibilities, but more importantly, it will open your mind to the possibility that you may be able to participate in this more easily than you can possibly imagine. I've told the story on this show many times of when I spontaneously went back in time. Those of you who follow the program and follow my journal entries know that I've had numerous experiences involving time slips and time travel just recently. This is possible. It's happening to me. It's happened to lots of other people. It could happen to you, and we are all about waking up on this program to the true potential of the human being. You can get involved in this in ways you do not expect. Time Travel Now will help you go down that path by making you realize it is possible and it is quite real. Now, speaking of, we're going to depart just a little bit from time travel right now because the story of these two tribes in China is so remarkable and fascinating. The Dropa and the Han. Bill, why don't you tell us what happened here?
Well, these unusual stones. Now, I must preface this by saying that I have had emails from people who tell me that this story is questionable or debatable. Okay, and but I have tried to include stories that have been around for some time and that have had some verification to them. And in this one, Chinese archaeologists spoke about these strange stone discs they found in a remote mountain cave in China, or more specifically in these mountains on the border that divides China and Tibet. And they went to this barely accessible mountain range, and this professor of archaeology at Beijing University had been leading some of his students on an expedition to survey a series of these caves in the Himalayan mountains. And he thought that some of these caves may be artificially carved and were like a complex system of tunnels and underground storerooms, because the walls were squared and they were glazed, and we've heard stories like this even out of South America. So, which speaks of some civilization that made use of underground facilities for some particular purpose. But they found burial sites inside these ancient caves. And so some of the skeletons that they found were only about 4 feet tall. And they were very frail and spindly with disproportionately large skulls. Well, that's interesting. What would that remind us of? But the current descriptions of the so-called graves. And, there was a suggestion maybe these were apes of some kind, but apes are not known to bury other apes under the floor of caves. So they found these stone discs also half buried in the dirt floor of the cave. And the disc is, about 9 inches in diameter. It's about 3/4 of an inch thick. In the exact center, it's perfectly round with a 3/4 inch hole, something like the old 78 RPM records. And the face of this disc is etched with a fine groove spiraling out from the center to the rim of the disc, just like a primitive phonograph record. And they're saying that one dated that these date back 10 to 12,000 years old.
Now
the
story has been questioned, but not very effectively, in that essentially the questioning has simply been along the lines of, well, this couldn't be true. But nobody's ever offered any evidence that these two tribes don't exist in China, and there is every evidence that they actually are they are there. So I want to, if you can believe it, Bill, we're already getting toward the end of Dreamland. We've only got a few minutes left. And,
oh, my God.
Yeah, we've got about 4 minutes left. And so in this 4 minutes, we've ranged all around and the possibilities of time travel today. Why don't you do this? Why don't you give us an idea of what you would like to leave us with in terms of this and in terms of your book, Time Travel Now?
Well, what I would like to leave you with as an impression is that time is an abstraction that we seem to experience that is very, very important in our lives. And because we're always interested in forecasting the weather, for instance. Memory is a form of time travel. I mean, I'm always mentally time traveling to my own past, and I'm always conjecturing about my own future. But in some instances, there are reports of precognition, where people have actually had some type of psychic vision of the future. And so the idea that time travel is mentally accessible, and the stories that have been examined on time slips where it seems to be physically accessible tells us that we don't fully understand what time is in this universe. And the possibility is that there may be many worlds around us, all on different time streams as well, out of phase with and out of running on a different rate, a clock rate than our own universe is running on. So this opens up the possibility to endless possibilities in this multiverse we live in. and may explain a lot of anomalies in our world. So it's worth a lot more looking into, a lot of research, investigation, and maybe even experimentation so that we can learn more about it.
You have in the book a story called A Walk Back in Time in Moundsville. This is a story, folks, it's a typical story of a group of people who were walking down a path, a road, and ended up in the past. Now, something in this story really struck me, and that was that the feeling that these people had of something flowing around them, the feeling like it was being in a hot tub with massagers on full blast and the streams of water make ripples on your skin. Now, a carriage passed through us and felt cold and like water almost, but not wet. This is exactly the sensation I had when I went back in time in March of 1983, and the moment I bent down to try to pick up a piece of paper that was in the gutter at my feet, this sensation went through my body, and it brought with it a feeling of loneliness so intense that I have said it was almost psychotic. It was so intense, the loneliness. And when I froze and stopped moving, I gradually ended up, the sounds around me changed, and I was eventually back in the present and went running home to be sure I was indeed in the present and that I was in the right present because I didn't know what had happened. Now, this is the first description I have ever read outside of my own experience of this precise sensation. So could you tell us in the next 3 or 4 minutes what exactly this walk back in time in Moundsville was all about?
Well, this story actually is a little bit of an exception from some other time displacement stories that I've heard of, in that it seemed to be a partial physical manifestation of the past, enough that events could be seen, people could be seen, but the experiencer was passing through objects that we would say were physical. This is not always the case. So it seems like whatever the process is, whereby the person is displaced into another time stream, it seems to have only been partially completed, that process, in this particular story. There are other stories. For instance, there's a story of this man and his son who went to visit the site of Custer's last stand. And they suddenly found themselves surrounded by men on horseback, Indians riding to and fro, and arrows flying through the air, guns being shot. And they couldn't imagine what was going on. They were wondering whether there was some kind of reenactment or what have you, when one of the soldiers, one of the cavalry, got shot, or got shot through with an arrow, and spurted blood, which landed on this guy's shirt. Okay, some drops of blood landed on his shirt. He was so close to this man that he started to run, and he grabbed his son, and they just started to run as fast as they could in the direction they had come from when all of the activity ceased. And then he thought, what was going on here?
Yeah, that would cross anyone's mind.
But it left a piece of physical evidence, because when he took off his shirt, he found blood stains. Now, how is that possible?
Well, to me, it's very possible. It very definitely is. Because as I say, I went back in time, and to me, the experience was as real as walking around the corner. Absolutely, and long before I had any close encounters of the third kind at all.
And by the way, it wasn't his blood, because he had it analyzed. It wasn't his type.
Yeah, I was just going to ask if he had the blood analyzed.
I guess enough to type the blood, and it wasn't his type. So this is what's so fascinating, is that the fact that he could apparently visit an era in the past, the real event, and come back with a trace of that event with him. That raises all sorts of questions, just all sorts of questions.
It certainly does, and I'm going to leave you with this. I felt as if I had picked up that piece of paper, I would have been stuck in the past, and I told my wife, if I ever disappear, look in the classified ads from the old New York Journal and those old newspapers at the library and see if you can find some signal from me. And I have often wondered if there aren't other travelers out there, even here among us, who are stuck in their own pasts. Time Travel Now, William F. Hamilton III. Get it from the unknowncountry.com bookstore. Get it anywhere you want to. It's a terrific book. Thank you, Bill, for a really fascinating dreamland. And don't forget, you subscribers, the Starfire Tour, Whitley Strieber, Ann Strieber, and Brandon Scott description and discussion of a time slip that we actually experienced recently. This is quite fascinating, and we've worked hard to document it, at least among the four witnesses, so that we can say with assurance that something really strange did occur. Don't forget this, because movement through time is possible. It is quite real, and the contactee who said it best when he said time is of the mind was, I think, telling the truth. We do not need to expend an enormous amount of physical energy to do this. It's not that far away. It's actually happening to people you know well, me and Ann. Okay, that said, up next, guess who? Linda Moulton Howe. You're about to experience something that you just can't get elsewhere. Emmy Award-winning science reporter Linda Moulton Howe reporting on the absolute leading edge of science discovery and the true mysteries of the unknown. Don't miss our website, earthfiles.com, the one science website that tells you the secrets and gives you the facts the others will not. earthfiles.com. This week, she has an interview with Jim Sparks, one of the world's most remarkable close encounter witnesses, who describes experiences of moving through time and just amazing, amazing things. He's got a new book out, too. We're going to be talking to him on Dreamland soon. Here she is from Albuquerque, Linda Moulton Howe.
That's right, Whitley. Jim has always been one of the most impressive people in the abduction syndrome that I have ever talked with. 11 years ago, at a conference about the human abduction syndrome, is the first time that I met him, and he was one of the participants. Jim was born Sparacino to his Italian parents 52 years ago on November 15th, 1954. Unlike many abductees who experience loss of consciousness and missing time, Jim's interactions with what he calls aliens have been mostly conscious. Even back in 1995 at the conference, Jim Sparks made a clear distinction between what he described as small gray drone worker types versus taller, true aliens or the supervisors as he perceived them. Jim explained that when he was 34 years old in 1988, he was happily married and had thriving real estate work in both Texas and North Carolina. Then suddenly, beings from some other world entered his life, and he thought he was losing his mind. Jim Sparks had interactions with two different types. One category was the gray-skinned, large, dark eyes that apparently come in many varieties, including small androids that do work for taller, very intelligent controllers. Another encounter was with tall, scaly-skinned humanoids that Jim says look like standing-up alligators or lizards. Over the 18 years from 1988 to the present day, Jim has been schooled by the Greys to learn their alien symbols and numbers. Jim says he was also contacted by alleged U.S. government intelligence operatives who wanted to know about the alien symbols and numbers that he was being taught. Jim says the reptilians warned that the Earth's environment is facing a crisis and that the planet must be saved whether humans survive or not. Now Jim Sparks has put his 18 years of interactions with non-humans into a new book entitled The Keepers, Alien Message for the Human Race. Of the many abductees I've interviewed, Jim has always impressed me with his down-to-earth attitude and common sense. So I recommend his new book, which can be ordered from the publisher on a limited promotional sale right now at this toll-free phone number, 800-366-0264. Again, that toll-free number to order Jim Sparks' new book is 800-366-0264. And I have a hot link to more information about Jim and his new book in this report at earthfiles.com. Jim has always stressed that when people see aerial craft jump from one side of the sky to the other, or see entities walk through solid walls, or feel a weight go down on their bed, but they can't see what's making the weight, it's all advanced technology. Recently, I asked him about his first-hand experiences with extraterrestrial abilities to manipulate time and matter.
Time in their eyes is quite a bit different, meaning that if you're a time traveler, so to speak, it's no big deal to you. It's just another technological apparatus. You can go from point A in time to point B in time anytime you want, almost as something as simple as using a remote control. In fact, from what I can see and experience with these beings, that it's almost mundane and boring to them. It's not even exciting to travel time. It's just something that they do. Since we're stuck in it, so to speak, it's extremely relevant to us.
From your perspective, the non-humans are even bored by the idea of time travel. Could you give a listener kind of your own personal experience with how did you even learn that, telepathically or how?
I think by a mistake, because there's one experience that I just can't forget, and I know it'll stick with me the rest of my life regarding time. Before the mistake, I should share the fact that whenever I was quote-unquote abducted, because I haven't found a perfect word for that yet, detained, abducted, whatever, if we were at doing certain tasks, and we would end the task, and let's say another one began, but for whatever reason they determined it was time to end it or for me to go back, a week could go by, a month could go by, and then I would be pulled again or abducted. I like to use the word pulled. And then I would find myself exactly where I left off, as if I never left and as if they never left the room. So manipulation of time is something that was extremely noticeable to me. So I can be around here for a few days, a few weeks, or a few months, and the next thing I know, I'm back where I was with them as if only 10 seconds went by. When I say a mistake, I had an experience, and bear in mind, most of these they're 98% conscious recall right in your face, where I was at home, and I got pulled. I was on the sofa. My hand was on my head, and my elbow was on the sofa, so I was laying sideways watching TV. There's a reason for me telling you this. I had gotten up. I had walked over to get something to eat and drink and snack on in the refrigerator. So I had to walk by an island. It was an island kitchen at the time, and I had to walk by the corner of the island to make a sharp right-hand turn to get into the kitchen area to get into the refrigerator. And so I got up off the sofa, walked across the living room, and I have an aquarium. So I looked at my fish for a few seconds, walked into the kitchen, opened up the refrigerator door, normal stuff, tinkered around in there, grabbed the soda, drank it, put it back, grabbed something to eat. I don't remember what it was. It was a snack. Shut the door, and I walked back around the aquarium through the living room and back on the sofa. And then I got pulled, which I wasn't expecting it. I had a 2-hour experience. So this was the first time with time manipulation where it was firsthand in my face, and it just astounded me. Because what happened was I had gone through the abduction experience for that 2-hour period. When I came back approximately anywhere from a minute to 2 minutes or so before I originally left, meaning that I found myself back on the sofa, but I could see myself get up, and I'm watching myself getting up from the sofa, walking around to the aquarium like I did earlier, and I just sat there with my mouth shut, not open, but just in shock, and I didn't make a sound. I could hear my footsteps. I could hear myself go into the kitchen as I saw myself. I heard the refrigerator door open. The light went on in the refrigerator, me tinking around, drinking the soda. I saw the whole scene. And then I watched myself come back through the kitchen. And this is not an out-of-body experience because, let me set a foundation here. All this stuff is technology. I've stuck to the logic of technology. I've not let myself drift to the left or right on that issue to try and get a frame of reference of what's really going on. And when I saw myself walking back to the sofa, I just said, well, here comes me, and what is me going to do when it sees me now? But that me did not even see me, and as it got closer, it started fading and then disappeared. So I saw something in solid, real life, myself back a minute or two before I left. Another area that also astounds me, and again, I take it in stride. I just look at these things like, hey, man, this is technology. It's nothing more than that. I'm not going to get spooked by it. I'm just going to witness it, see if I can figure it out. You know, I'm not a technician. I'm not a scientist. But I'm going to take as much of a science approach as I possibly can. There is an invisibility factor there. They have the ability to be invisible. From what I can really figure when it comes to the invisibility stuff is that they create a field. They just create some kind of electrical field, and anything within the perimeter of the field, the laws of physics don't apply as we understand them. Meaning that's why you can see them sometimes in whole, or they look faded, or we see them walking through walls. Are they really walking through walls, or are they displacing matter, that's the wall, in this field? They literally are going through solid matter.
From the technology point of view, it sounds as if the non-humans could deflect photons, which would make them instantly invisible, and that they also have some kind of control and manipulation at the atomic or the molecular level?
Their technology is so sophisticated, so I'll address one level. Again, it's almost this invisibility thing. They can toy with the mind. Now, remember, a perfect example would be if you're walking along the sidewalk and you see a red ant pile, and somehow, technically, we managed to communicate with one of the ants. That would be a feat in itself. Now, our mind is thinking a million miles an hour, and this ant is just looking at us going like, gee, for the first time I'm seeing a human face. How can you tell that ant what a car payment is? It doesn't even understand what anything is, let alone its own ant pile and farming and whatever an ant does. So, relatively speaking, when I say toy with our minds, they understand the basic human day-to-day stimuli and visuals. In other words, if you're in your car and you're driving down the highway, you're looking at signs, you're looking at the other cars, you may see a flock of birds fly by, all the natural things that we do. But what they do is they take the natural things and form, for example, you might see a flock of birds, and you think it's a flock of birds, but they'll transmit an energy into your mind to make you, and work with the chemicals in your mind, and the way the electrical system works in our body and so forth, the brain. So you think you're seeing a flock of birds, and so does everybody else on the highway. And actually it could be a formation of alien ships. So they are transmitting something.
Well, I understand this whole idea of a screen memory that has been discussed in the abduction literature since the 70s by Leo Sprinkle and Bud Hopkins and others. And the screen memory has been things like a deer or an owl or, as you're saying, bird, something that is manipulated.
Absolutely. I didn't mean to override you, but yes. Something that you would just see every day and not give it a second thought.
Right.
Now, see, the reason I spot these things from time to time is because I've had so much exposure over the last 18 years to ET technology and how they screen image and how they work. And I've been adamant about not being friendly with them and having a frame of reference that I can understand and try and keep it as logical and scientific as possible, even though in the early years it was pretty terrorizing, this trickery. It's so good, it's like a chameleon. A chameleon can blend into a scenery, or like there's some octopus that can do that at the bottom of the sea. They can look like the seafloor, the other fish don't notice them, and they're such masters at this. Mm-hmm. I mean, they are absolute masters that a ship can be a car in your parking lot, and you just don't give it a second thought. Your brain just sees a car and goes. It doesn't even say that. It doesn't even say the word in your mind. So you've got to remember what we're dealing with. We're dealing with beings that have the capacity to retain and simulate more data and also process more data, I should say. They've been around longer. They can think faster.
And it sounds like that they can take atoms and molecules and manipulate them any way that they want to look like anything that they want us to see. And it reminds me of a deputy who once said they even saw a glowing red square in a grove of trees where they were investigating animal mutilations, and the next morning they went back and there were their tire tracks where they had stopped the night before, and the grove of trees that had the red glowing square in it didn't even exist. Mm-hmm. Even the trees had been some kind of a screen memory.
Exactly. But you're dealing with different technologies. Again, it's almost like in having a universal remote control. You've got the remote control that creates invisibility. You've got the remote control that does camouflage techniques. You've got the remote control button that can create a field. I say a field, it's like an electrical field for lack of a better definition, and I'm not a scientist, but sometimes there's even a hum associated with it that I pick up. But they create a field, and they can manipulate. You'll see things that they want you to see, and they can manipulate matter in that way. But what really intrigues me is that this definition of dimensions is how they can be 5 or 10% in our dimension in this physical plane. So in other words, let's say you're in your living room, you see something that looks like an apparition or a ghost because you can kind of see through it. Well, they may be 2 or 3% in our dimension, and they're 98 or 97% solid in some other dimension. There's dimensions out there that are like layers, like an onion. I mean, they go by the thousands that, in a sense, they squeeze into, but they don't really. They molecularly change the vibration of something where they can be in another dimension and solid and be 5 or 10% here. Now, that's when they're doing, I think, like, in a sense, research work where they don't have to handle physical items or objects in this dimension or a plane. I see that sometimes they'll be 40 or 50 or 60% in our dimension if they need to move solid objects here. But it's self-defense. So in other words, if you charge at them, they're gone. Or if you charge at them, I mean charging at them like running at them or an attack or anything of that nature, you can put your hand right through them. You know, we work with 5 senses, and there are other senses involved. There are other dimensions involved. There's things that our minds can't conceptualize because we don't even have a grasp of it. And again, I'm going to go back to the ants on the ant pile. Let's say you pulled one out and you had it at the end of your fingertip, and it could talk to you. You say, hey, you're an ant, and it said, wow, I heard you. Yes, I am an ant. And then you try to explain to it what a trip to the beach would be like. There's nothing for that ant to associate a trip to the beach because it can't imagine the ocean. It can't even imagine a car. It can't imagine a towel. It can't imagine any of these things because it's a little ant pile. So there's a certain edge that they have regarding their science. I've seen them take an object, for example, let's say you take something as simple as a can of soda pop. They can take 1 can of soda pop and make 2 cans of soda pop with it. But however, each can would have 50% of the molecular structure and weight divided evenly. And then they can do it in quarters. And then they can do it in eighths. And then they can break it down into thousandths. And then the next thing you know, you're looking through these cans. And that's what they do with their technology. You push a button, so to speak, and you have time travel. You push another button, you have invisibility. So it's not like each individual ET is like a high-tech wizard. They're just like any other person that's using a tool.
Do you have any sense now in 2006 where the real origin is for the Greys?
Well, when we say Greys, you have worker beings, which in my experience they're created just for that purpose. They're part biological, they're part robotic, And these things are used as a tool for labor, even if it's technical. And I think a lot of these beings, these biological worker beings, are mistaken as extraterrestrials. My experience primarily has been in what you would call grays and some in what would be referred to as reptilian, snake-like, lizard-like beings, but they all seem to have all these little workers as a tool. Mm-hmm. And so when you say, gee, where are they from? Well, could it be they're working in another dimension? Could it be from another time? Could it be from another place? Can it be from another star? Can it be a race of ETs that are not of the two that I just mentioned, but they'll have them with them? So when you take into consideration the fact that traveling time means nothing, invisibility is nothing, getting from point A to point B is nothing. And what I've learned about them is they're extreme masters of deception. And meaning that almost anything that we can come up with, and I'm not trying to belittle our scientists and I'm not trying to belittle any agencies that are really studying this stuff at heart, they can lead them to believe, as you could an ant, anything you want, they can lead you to believe that anything that you're seeing you think is the technology and it's completely different from what they're using.
And, Jim, what now in 2006 do you in your heart of hearts think that the Greys, what do they want?
What I've come to in the last 18 years, they're going from point A to point B, spanning the universe, as resource collectors or business people, and they're on a journey going from point A to point B, and collecting things, whatever they collect, and it's business for them. Then there's a group that goes from point A to point B. When I say collect resources, I think collect excess energy from human beings, be it love, be it hate, be it whatever necessary to create worker beings. It's a resource. And then there's a mass that just travels, and this is almost like a truck stop. But in the process, one side doesn't give a hoot about us at all one way or the other, not that they're good or bad. They're just going from point A to point B, and if they stop here, stop here. The world where they're trying to shoot them down and do all these things to them and speculating that, oh, they're doing this or they're up to that or they're up to this. They're doing what they're doing regardless of what stage we're at. I think what we are here to them as a whole, when you ask me that question to simplify it, is we're about 0.5% of what they're about, and 99.5% is something else that we don't have any clue what they're doing. And what we're seeing is that 0.5% in our face from time to time, which is this whole phenomena.
And you can read a lot more about all of this in Jim's new book that's entitled The Keepers, Alien Message for the Human Race, which can be ordered from the publisher on a limited promotional sale now at this toll-free phone number, 800-366-0264. And Whitley, I wondered if you have had an experience in all of your interactions in which you have been aware of this percentage split, this ability somehow to extend molecules or atoms in percentages.
No, Linda, I really can't say that I have. I was interested in the movement through time part of it, though, because I have had some recent experiences involving this, and I was, and I don't think everybody tries to come up with some explanation for what they're doing. And his is very interesting and very unique, and somehow or another doesn't seem to me to be too complete, in the sense that if this is only a tiny part of what they're doing, and that may indeed be true, then where is all of the interest coming from? Because they spent 11 years in my life. That's a long time for someone who's only just barely interested in what's going on here.
I don't think that he means they're barely interested. He meant that there are types who come and go, but the ones that have interacted with him, and he stresses this in the book, that in their focus on humans, that is an area where they think that we are quite unique as a life form. Whether or not they were responsible for manipulating genetic material to create us in the first place or someone else was, whatever we are now, Jim thinks that we are a unique life form and of great interest to some of them, and that there are others, just like we have corporate trade people on this planet, who are only interested in harvesting energy and genetics and minerals for whatever they do, and that it's this wide range that when we are talking about the abduction syndrome, and there is a focus on you or Jim or the thousands of others over the years, that is some kind of a project that, to me as an investigative reporter, when I look at all of the interviews and the questions over all of these years, what do you think these non-humans really want? I think I am stunned by the fact that after all these years, I still don't have a clear picture, and none of the people in the human abduction syndrome have a clear picture either.
Which tells us that either they do not want us to have a clear picture, or somebody is holding something back from us. Linda, thank you for an extremely provocative report. Folks, take a look at Jim Sparks' website. It is quite interesting, and his new book, very well worth your consideration. Next week, Graham Hancock will be with us, the famed author of Fingerprints of the Gods, now with a new book out about the mysterious and incredible origin of the human mind, supernatural. You will not soon forget the interview you're going to hear on Dreamland next week. Then later in the season, we go up and up and up. Jim Mars has got a new book out, The Terror Conspiracy. Daniel Pinchbeck is going to be with us, a famous Daniel Pinchbeck, with his new book, 2012, about Quetzalcoatl. It's got a lot about Whitley Strieber in it, too, oddly enough. I can't think why. But we're going to be talking to him and finding out about all of those things. John Major Jenkins is going to be with us. Quite a lineup, folks. Dreamland, it's the only show of its kind in the world, the only place where you get this kind of really in-depth interviewing. It is unique in the world, and so is UnknownCountry.com. Daily news of the edge, every day, edited by none other than our beloved Ann Strieber, who does an excellent job. Don't miss a single day of it. And while you're at it, sign up for our free newsletter. Get into this. This is important stuff. It is unique in the world. There's nothing else like it. And if you have a little bit of money in your pocket, well, become a subscriber. By science, they suddenly become very, very much more powerful. And by the way, speaking of powerful, I want you to read Whitley's journal this week because of the children. This is a journal about, it's a reflection on the 1985 Finders case that came up in my mind because I was thinking, of course, about the awful, sad Mark Foley situation, so tragic and so ugly, and how there is a lot of child abuse being hidden behind the walls of secrecy and power. And I happened to get a copy of a report by an investigator, a U.S. Customs Service investigator, who investigated the Finders case, and you really need to look at the journal and read this report. It is extraordinary, and it was all covered up by the CIA. That can't stand. We have to do something about this. We cannot let our children be abused by people in power simply because they're powerful. It's just not on. We'll be right back. We're back, and we're talking to William Hamilton, Bill Hamilton. We've been talking about Dr. Dan Burish, and we were in the lab with Dr. Dan Burish, and he was communicating via thought with a visitor called J-Rod, who had just told him that he was one of us, that he was from our future. Dan, why don't you pick up the story? Bill, why don't you pick up the story at this point?
Okay, well, he found out through communication and then with the J-Rod, and then later through briefings that he was given once the powers that be found out that he had been in communication with the J-Rod, and he found out that the J-Rod was from our distant future. In fact, 52,000 years ahead of our time.
and Brandon Scott will be with us in the subscriber section talking about a time slip that Ann and I and the two of them experienced just recently. It was quite astonishing, and we will be describing it in detail and the efforts that we have made to document the reality of this event, which I think, since all four of us in different ways were witness to it, is quite amazing. So do listen up in the subscriber section. Here on Dreamland, we have an exciting expert with us, the author of Time Travel Now, William F. Hamilton III. Bill is a former Air Force Security Service member. He has been involved with the National Security Agency, and he's also written a really cool book called Time Travel Now, the latest information, facts, and strange stories on the incredible reality of time travel. And some of the stories I've referred to in passing in previous shows about time travel, such as the mysterious events at Versailles and other stories like this, Bill's nailed them all down. So we're going to be getting into that over the course of this interview. We're going to have I think, a really interesting time. Bill, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Whitley.
Let me ask you this. One always thinks of time travel as kind of a science fictional thing. And yet in here, I have read material that is so close to experiences I've actually had, and we'll get into that later in the program, that I have to ask you, frankly, where do you come out? I mean, as a researcher in this, are we in a world in which time travel happens?
I believe that we are in a universe in which time travel happens.
Now, in a universe, you make it sound larger than just us. In other words, of course, there's close encounters of the third kind going on in our world too. Do you suggest then that there is something related to time travel there?
Well, yes, but in fact, what I was talking about is space travel. When we have space travel between solar systems, then we're...
of what had happened to them. So why don't we begin by you telling us a little bit about Dan Burish and his background and his bona fides.
Dan Burish, also previously known as Dan Crane, he changed his name legally in Las Vegas, was a kind of a child prodigy who grew up interested in the microscope. In fact, he was one of the youngest members of the Los Angeles Microscopical Society, and he's also trained in looking for at cells and looking at various pathologies under the microscope by a medical doctor in Long Beach. And as he grew up, his grandfather passed away from cancer. So when he went and entered the University of Nevada at Las Vegas, his parents had relocated to Las Vegas. He studied biology with every intent to go on to postgraduate studies in medicine and medical research. It was in 1986 when Dan was in college and started his biological research that he was approached by three men. He had written a proposal to NASA about, he was interested in Martian exobiology as well, and this had to do with the transplantation of protozoa to Martian exobiology. And he had indeed got a reply from NASA, which was very positive. And so probably following this, these three men, I believe two of them identified themselves as being with the Department of Naval Intelligence, had come up to him and offered him a position in a very shadowy government project. And just to kind of make a long story short, that's when Dan accepted the offer, by the way, and then was sent up to Area 50, talking about relativistic velocities. and relativistic velocities of space traveling will always involve some time traveling because there's the time differential between the clock on the spacecraft and the point of departure.
We all understand the fact that relativity would induce de facto time travel in anyone who was traveling at a speed approaching the speed of light.
Well, this is where I start, because this is where science comes in. In other words, science will admit that if we travel at 99% of the velocity of light and visit Alpha Centauri and return to the Earth, our point of departure, we will find out that we have only traversed that distance in about, a year or so. And yet maybe 4 to 8 years have passed on the Earth. In other words, what I'm pointing out here is that time travel may be happening more commonly than we think.
Well, I would certainly agree with you there, because there is, especially in the sense of that Stephen Hawking, for example, now admits that movement through time, I think it was in October of 1993, he said he believed that movement through time must be possible. But science assumes it would take an enormous amount of energy. However, for those of us to whom it has happened, I mean, I was standing on a street corner in New York when it happened to me. There was no energy involved at all. I just suddenly kind of slipped back into the past, and a lot of people you mentioned in your book did that too. But before we get into that, let's touch on the alien connection again, because you mentioned a man named Dan Burish in the book who makes a surprising statement about an alien he allegedly interviewed called J-Rod, claiming that he had come back from the future, that he was, in fact, at least partially a human being, and they had come back into the past to try to correct their own past because...
One briefly, followed again by being sent up to an underground facility at the highly secretive Site 4 near Area 51, and that's located under Papoose Mountain on the Nevada test site. And he was astonished at the equipment that had been transported and set up in the newly established biolabs that occupied level 4 and 5. And one thing led to another, and that's how Dan had an encounter with the J-Rod, which the J-Rod was an extraterrestrial biological entity housed within a clean sphere on level 5 of that very same facility.
And we'll be returning to that facility in just a moment. Bill Hamilton's book, Time Travel Now, available from the unknowncountry.com store, bookstores everywhere. Don't miss it. And don't miss Starfire Tor and Brandon Scott, Ann Strieber and Whitley Strieber in a really remarkable discussion about an actual time slip that occurred in all 4 of our lives at the same quote-unquote time just a few weeks ago in the subscriber section. And here's something equally incredible in a way in the lead article in the November... And here's something equally incredible in the lead article in the new... And here's something equally incredible. The lead article in the New Scientist for the September 30th issue is about an experiment that's going to be performed soon that will confirm or deny whether or not the past is affected by its own future. We will be able to determine using this experiment whether or not things we do now can change the past. Is it actually happening? Well, listening to Bill Hamilton and listening to what the incredible story you're going to hear in the subscriber section, I have to think apparently it is. And we're getting closer and closer to knowing that and empirically confirming it. And as we learned from Dean Radin, once these things are confirmed,